I had been going to start this by saying that the whole 2 days was taken up with our talking about how wonderful we were, and libertarians explaining to libertarians why libertarianism was great, and that I was going to try to provide a little bit of a contrast to that. But then she provided that contrast yesterday by telling us what was wrong with libertarians. I'm going to go a little bit further and tell you what's wrong with libertarianism. That is to say, I am going to talk about those problems in our positions, both our economic and our ethical positions, which seem to me to be serious ones. I should say that I am not going to give any answers at all in the speech, only problems. I may discuss answers during the question period if you like. Some of these questions are things to which I have answers in the sense that I have something productive to say about them, not in the sense of having resolved them. Some of them are questions to which I do not have any answer. Some of them are questions which are very bothersome because not only I don't know how to answer them, but they imply that some of the things I do know aren't true. Those are the ones that come at the end, and I hope they upset you as much as they upset me. Now let me start with the one which I thought that Dr. Rothbard treated rather cavalierly as a question yesterday, the problem of public goods. And let me try to state simply what the problem is and try to define what a public good is. A public good is a good which has the characteristic that if it is produced at all, it must be produced for all of the members of a pre-existing group of people. All right? Movie theaters do not fall into that category. If I produce a movie theater, I can keep out people who don't pay me. What things do fall into that category? Well, the typical case that I like to state is the problem of a valley which is periodically flooded by a river, and somebody wants to build a dam to prevent that flooding. All right? There are a lot of different landholders in the river, in the valley. If the dam is built, all of those landholders will benefit by it, whether or not those particular landholders contribute to building the dam. Now, what's the problem? Well, normally in the market, you find out what something is worth to people by going to each person and saying, look, how much is it worth to you? How much will you pay me? And if you don't pay it, you don't get it. You can't make that offer except to the group as a whole in the case of a public good. Let me be a little more specific in my hypothetical dam case. Let's suppose there are 1,000 people living in the valley, and the value to each of those 1,000 people of having his land protected from the floods is $100. That means the total, what I mean by that is that if he were offered the choice, you can have your land protected and pay $100, he'd just be on the margin. If you don't pay, you don't get your land protected. That's what I mean by the value. So therefore, the total value to the people in the valley of having the dam built is $100,000. Let's suppose the cost of building the dam is $80,000. Now, I want to raise money to build that dam. I'm an entrepreneur. It sounds like a good, profitable project. I go to the first farmer in the valley and say, will you agree that if I build the dam, you will pay me $100? He thinks about it a while, and he says, how is the probability of your building the dam affected by making that agreement? Well, clearly, if you don't get enough other people to do it, there's no effect. You don't build the dam, I don't pay you $100. If without me you get enough people to raise the $80,000 to build the dam, then you will build the dam whether I contribute $100 or not. The only case in which my contributing the $100 gets me something, in which it makes the dam built instead of not built, is the case where my $100 just puts it over the margin between your not being able to afford to build the dam and being able to afford it. And he figures it out with his estimate of how stingy his neighbors are, and he figures out the chance of that occurring is only, say, 1 in 50. All right? Therefore, he's putting down $100 not to get $100 worth of benefit, but to get a 1 chance in 50 of getting $100 worth of benefit. All right? He is better for putting down that $100 only if the dam gets built because he put it down and wouldn't have gotten built otherwise. That's the free rider problem. All right? The way Dr. Rothbard put it was as a moral assault on the evil people who get the protection of the dam for free. Nothing wrong with getting things for free if you get them. The problem occurs when the dam isn't built because you can't raise the money, because each person rationally calculating his own self-interest concludes it does not pay him to put up the money. All right, that's the public good problem. I would like to suggest that, among other things, that problem is one of the reasons we do not now have anarchy. What I mean by that is that it is my opinion that it is that abolishing at least the first 90% of government, and very possibly 100%, is in the benefit of at least 98% of the population. This has to do with the fact that I don't believe there's a ruling class, in the sense of a class that really profits from government. There are lots of people who think they profit from government, namely almost everybody. But I believe it would be in the interest of 98% of the people. Therefore, why don't those 98% of the people get together and buy off the politicians and abolish government? Because abolishing government is a public good. If you abolish government, I benefit by it. That, in effect, is the whole problem of changing the society. All libertarian activities are, in a sense, caught in the public good problem. That the benefit, if I give speeches and persuade people to sell off the government, I will get only a very small fraction of the benefit of that action. Now, there's nothing wrong with that if I give the speeches. But there will be some cases in which people won't. There will be some cases in which people won't spend the money to provide something that's worth more than it would cost because there's no way they can get the benefit themselves. All right, enough about the public good problem. Problem number two. We, as believers in the market, are justly suspicious of any value determined in any way except market value. What I mean by that is, if you come up to me and say, oh, it's very, very important that I should have this, I'll say, how much do you pay for it? And we tend to feel, with I think considerable justice, that is the answer to that question is really the only meaningful sense in which we can talk of what something's worth to somebody. That before that, it's all histrionics. It's all oratory. And only when you find out what are you willing to give up for something do you have a meaningful measure of value. All righty. Now, we have civil suits. Well, suppose we have a good free market anarchist society. I want to know how, in principle, when my car is skidded off the road and smashed into your house, or broken your arm or something, how, in principle, we decide how much money you owe me. All right? My car skids and breaks your arm. How can I be in a position of finding out a market price for your having your arm broken? Right? We can find out how much the doctor costs. We can find out how much time you lose on your job. But that's not the real cost of it. It includes your discomfort, the fact that you don't like lying in a hospital bed, all sorts of other things. So, in principle, it's easy to say, well, we'll set up a free market court system and it'll decide. I want to know on what basis, in principle, that free market court system would decide. All right, that's my problem number two. All right, my problem number three is the question, well, let me introduce my problem number three by a very amusing story that I think one of my parents heard on the television and repeated. The story about a man who was sitting at home waiting to hear who had been stealing his firewood. Man lived out in the countryside and he had a pile of firewood, which was of some value to him. It was a considerable nuisance to cut more. And he found that someone had been stealing quite a lot of wood from his firewood pile. Well, he tried to, I don't know, he put up a fence or he tried to keep an eye out or something. He did all the easy, convenient things and didn't work. They kept stealing it. So he took a stick of firewood, drilled a hole in it, inserted a stick of dynamite, put it back in the pile, and sat at home waiting to hear who had stolen his firewood. Now, it sounds initially beautiful, but I am very unhappy about the problem of the ethics of that solution. That's a special case of the general question of what are the ethics of the relationship of the victim to the criminal. All right? It seems sort of intuitively clear to me that the victim does not have an unlimited claim against the criminal. If a man trespasses on my front lawn and I turn loose with a machine gun, something's wrong. All right? But then what is the proper basis? Well, the first suggestion that you would make is that I have a right to use an amount of force doing an amount of damage to you no greater than the damage you would have done to me. I don't like that. That seems to me is very unsatisfactory. That's a sort of a moral blackmail in which what you say is, well, I will arrange to rob you in such a way that the only way you can stop me is to kill me, and since I'm robbing something worth less than my life, you can't do it. Don't like that one. All right, well, the next one is, I have the moral right to use whatever is the minimal amount of force necessary to achieve my end. That it would be all right to turn loose the machine gun if there really were no other way of doing it, but there is another way. The trouble with that is that, as all of us who are interested in market economics know, you can't really talk of what's necessary to achieve your end. You can only talk about different ways of doing things at different prices. It may very well be that if I'm willing to pay a very large cost, I can manage to prevent your crime while doing you very little injury. Maybe the guy with the firewood, if he hires a guard to stand out over the woodshed every night. But that cost may to me seem unreasonably high. Do I have the right to choose to use a cheaper way, which will blow you up, or will injure you in some other ways? Now, I have not yet seen anything that seems to me to be a satisfactory analysis, a satisfactory approach to where you would begin answering that kind of a question. There's another question which is related to that. That's the question of legitimate punishment or restitution. There's a fairly standard argument which is made which says that what I have a right to do when I catch the criminal is to take from him the damage he's done to me, plus people usually would argue the cost to me of catching him. And that's the limit of my claim. Now, I agree there has to be some limit to my claim. It seems to me very unreasonable to say that, again, that if the guy trespasses on my lawn, I can follow him up and charge him $100,000 for the privilege. However, that particular limit, I think, is unsatisfactory for a very simple practical reason. That reason is that unless the costs of catching criminals are very high, or unless the percentage of criminals caught is very high, crime will be profitable. All right? I'm a criminal. I'm engaged in market calculations just like anybody else. I may be a little less moral than other people, but laws of economics still work for me. And I say, well, I'm going to steal $1,000 from him. I got two choices. Either I'm caught or I'm not caught. If I'm caught, I got to give him back the $1,000 plus 25 extra for his time and trouble catching me. If I'm not caught, I get to keep the $1,000. Well, he's got to catch me. He's got to have a very large odds of catching me before that becomes unprofitable. It reminds me of another story about a man who had a very profitable little business. He was in the business of selling people a drug that would make their child come out the right sex. Very simple. He's got colored water. Some of it's pink and some of it's blue. And he says to the customer, what do you want, a boy or a girl? Have your wife drink the blue water and she'll have a boy. Drink the pink water and she'll have a girl. Cost you $10, and if it doesn't work, you get your money back. Well, it's the same game. So the conclusion you reach merely as a practical conclusion is that you have to have some element of punishment. You have to have some substantial cost above and beyond the damage done to you, or else crime will be profitable for the criminal. Now, that doesn't tell you anything, though, about what the proper basis for deciding it is. Because, in a sense, if I were arguing against this case, I would say, well, look, you're saying that the criminal who gets caught is to be punished for the criminal who doesn't get caught. Well, probabilistically, I am. I'm saying that he's got to pay enough so that, on the average, being a criminal doesn't pay. And yet it does seem rather strange to say that I am more guilty because somebody else was committing crimes or something like that. So it seems to me this is another area where I am entirely unsatisfied with the solutions the people have so far proposed and suggest that somebody get busy and propose some better solutions. Another area, which unfortunately is not going to concern us in a practical way for quite a while, is the question of the moral status of liberated property. That applies on a small scale, I suppose, to property gotten back from a thief. It would apply on a much larger scale to the property which is presently legally the property of the U.S. government. The question is, take the question in the general case. A man has stolen from lots of people. He almost certainly has assets smaller than the total amount he's stolen. Now, who's got the claim to those assets when he's caught? Well, there are a number of possible things you could say. You could say the people he's stolen from. My first instinct is to say anybody he's stolen from has a claim against him for the full amount stolen, and essentially first come, first served. If I manage to find where he's hidden his loot, I can take that amount of it. And the fact that other people end up with nothing because he spent a good deal of the loot, that's too bad. They were less enterprising. Another possible thing you could say is we should divide it according to how much he stole. Another thing you could say is that the guy who found the thief really ought to have it. This is less ridiculous than it seems. Imagine you have a successful revolution against the U.S. government. It's not something which I expect or advocate. For reasons having nothing to do with this discussion, I regard revolutionary activity as counterproductive. One of the things I felt when Sharon was giving her talk is I'm in favor of toleration. There are many different things that one can do that will help to bring liberty. But not all the things one's morally entitled to do will help to bring liberty. And I think that there are maybe some things you're morally entitled to do that don't help to bring liberty, like shooting politicians. So I'm not advocating. I'm really saying let us imagine some future scenario in which virtuous libertarian revolutionaries have managed to liberate lots of things, including the national parks. And then I go to them and I say, I'm a taxpayer, I want my share of the national parks. And they say, oh, no, wait a minute. Property comes by productive activity. That national park, after all, a lot of us would say that the origin of the ownership of land is that I made that land usable. I took something of zero value, originally, land which was overgrown with tall trees, and I cleared it. So I produced the value. Well, prior to the activities of this revolutionary, those national parks were of zero value. They were infested by some very dangerous wildlife, which had the effect that anybody who tried to farm it got attacked, driven off, put in jail. All sorts of unfortunate things happened to them. So therefore, it could be argued that the current value of that land has been produced by the revolutionaries who cleared it of those objective existence which prevented that land from being of any value. And so maybe when Walter and Ralph have their revolution, and I come to them with my tax receipts in my pocket and say, I want my share of Yellowstone, they're going to say, no, you had your chance. You could have taken your share of Yellowstone when Yellowstone was a free good for anybody who could successfully take it. Now it's property which we've created. We've put the value in it. I'll be glad to sell you a little of the land at a reasonable fee. All right, so that it seems to me is a problem. There are a lot of other problems related with that which come in a little bit earlier in our present situation. The problem of property which is in some sense in a mixed status. That is to say, there is a tendency, which I think I have observed among some libertarians who like to work with the left, and who therefore are under considerable intellectual pressure to think up libertarian excuses for what the left wants to do, just like all of us used to be under intellectual pressure to think up libertarian excuses for what the right wanted to do, that some such people make an argument along the following lines. Something, the property of a corporation, or the property of a private school that takes government money, is tainted property. It's partly theft. They've gotten stolen property and they're using it. Therefore, we've got a right to take it over. Now, I'm very unhappy with that argument because I'm not sure that there is anybody, including any libertarian, who on those grounds has a right to his own property. Let's take, for instance, my friend Karl Hess. He worked for the Republican Party, for Senator Goldwater in 1964. I presume, therefore, I may be wrong, but I would guess that some part of his income, if you traced it down, at some point came from voluntarily cooperating with somebody who was stealing money. I don't know whether he was ever paid by the government directly. I don't know his life history. But if not, he was paid by a political party which gets its money directly or indirectly by auctioning stolen goods. I mean, that's where you get political contributions mainly. So therefore, does that mean that I can walk into Carl's houseboat, if that's what he has now? It was an apartment when I knew him, and take. He's got all sorts of very nice things I'd like. He has pistols, for instance. I like pistols. Carl's a good shot. He's got all sorts of beautiful things I'd like to take. Can I say, well, they don't belong to anybody? After all, they're 3% stolen property. I can pick them up? I don't think so. I'm very unhappy with that conclusion. And my instinct is to say, well, we've got until disputes on such matters have been settled by some reasonable arbitration procedure, we have to proceed on the presumption that we will treat as having a property right whoever has the best property right. If you got an 80% property right to it, in some sense or other, sure, it's true that some of the money you had was at some level somewhere back stolen, but mostly you engaged in productive activity and used it to buy your house. I can't claim the house just because 5% of it is tainted. Maybe eventually when we have a libertarian court system we could settle the question of whether you owe me $15, but you don't owe me the house. That's my feeling of the direction that I would like somebody to go, and maybe somebody like Ralph who knows something about law and the way these problems have been traditionally worked out could do something on that. But it seems to me that that is a difficult problem, and I'm very unhappy with the people who say, sort of, we can grab anything that belongs to any large corporation, anything which at some point was given to somebody by the government, etc., etc., etc. Incidentally, one thing I find rather amusing in the whole argument, I don't know if the point has ever been raised before, but some people argue that the wealth of the corporations is suspect because of the principle of limited liability. All right? Now that's a very curious argument because it implies that the only corporations whose wealth is suspect are those that don't exist. Limited liability says that when a corporation goes bankrupt, the stockholders of the corporation cannot be sued for its holdings. Therefore, limited liability is only useful when the corporation goes bankrupt. Therefore, all existent corporations have not taken advantage of it. Therefore, you cannot, as far as I can tell, argue that they have unjustly acquired wealth because of limited liability. The only people you can argue that about, if anyone, are the people who were stockholders in corporations that are now bankrupt. All right, I think I've got another problem that I'm leaving out, but I'll probably have to just... Oh, yes, that'll come. No, well, yeah. All right. Last thing along this series, there's more and more coming, is the question which was touched on by to some extent in an earlier speech on Kid Lib. This is the general question of what are the criteria for transition points. At what point do we decide something is or is not a human being, does or doesn't have rights? This is the question when your 3-year-old toddles towards the door with the heavy traffic outside, and you say, do you want to go out the door? And she says, yes. She can talk fine. Do you lock the door? At what, if not, most of the people here, I suspect, think abortion should be legal. All right, well, where do you draw the distinction? Is it just because it comes out of the body? That question was raised, I think, in one of the questions. Another question which I guess doesn't bother people who think they've derived their ethics in a very straightforward fashion, but bothers me, is the rights of animals. I am not convinced that a cat is entirely different in nature from a human being. It's clearly not exactly the same, doesn't have exactly the same rights. But my reaction to a person killing a cat, in terms of the ethical judgments I am making, is not all that different in kind. It may be different in degree from my reaction to a person killing a child. That my feeling is that a cat appears to be a being having free will. I don't know whether it thinks rationally or not. I can't talk to it, which creates great difficulties. But it certainly acts to achieve objectives. It, to some extent, calculates in advance and so forth. And I think it would be at least nice if somebody could, we can all orate. Human beings are the only rational animals and all the rest of that. But my impression is it's very clear that you can draw a clear line between human beings and other animals. There's a fascinating experiment going on, I don't know how far it's gotten yet, in Nevada, where some people are trying to are raising a chimpanzee, teaching it to teach deaf and dumb language, teaching it to speak deaf and dumb language, hand language. Their theory was, maybe the reason we haven't been able to teach animals to speak is not that animals don't have the brain for it, but that animals don't have the vocal control. That they never had any reason to evolve the ability to use their mouths in very complicated ways and to have the parts of the brain to control their mouths and so forth. Well, chimps use their hands all the time. My impression is the present status of the experiment is that the chimp uses a fair variety of words and uses them in contexts which are not just sort of repeating what it's taught, but look like talking sentences. Looks like maybe a chimp is just a very stupid person. Now, I don't know, but I think it's at least a question which might be worth thinking about a little. And last, of course, is in this series is the question that I was trying to to pin the previous speaker to the wall on with limited success of what the rights and obligations of parents are. That is, can the parent say, as long as you live in my house, you've got to do what I say? Well, to some extent, I feel certainly. Without limit, can he say, you've got to do anything, the only option is leaving? Or does the parent have some kind of an obligation to take care of the child? All right, that finishes my first series. My second series are centered around what we mean by a libertarian ethic. Seems to me there are two different senses in which a person could call himself a libertarian. He could call himself a libertarian in the sense of meaning that he regards as the paramount political objective having the maximum amount of liberty. Or he could call himself a libertarian in the sense of meaning that he believes that having the maximum amount of liberty is a highly desirable thing, but that one cannot violate other people's rights to achieve that end. That he is himself bound by a set of absolute moral statements saying you can't enslave, murder, and so forth. Now, it seems to me that one can interpret, with a little charity, but not an enormous amount of charity, the attitudes of many conservatives as being libertarian in the first sense. For instance, Bill Buckley. It seems to me Bill Buckley could say, I'm in favor of having as much freedom as possible, but it is my judgment, which disagrees with yours, that the maximum amount of freedom we can have is a situation in which, say, communists are arrested for preaching communism, because it's my calculation that if they aren't, we'll end up with a communist state, and that'll be much worse. Now, the argument may be correct or incorrect. It is not, it seems to me, obviously false. You could have a situation, I think. Some people will say, no, a priori it's impossible to ever get freedom by violating freedom. I think that's false. I think that sounds very pretty. But I can imagine certain unusual situations where it seems to me you could get freedom by violating freedom. Now, it's clear, I shouldn't say it's clear. Let me say something else first. I have observed the following interesting phenomenon of human behavior. Nobody ever believes that something is both immoral and necessary. You see lots of people who think that the Vietnam War is immoral for reasons which are separate from whether it's desirable or not. That is, the reason they think the Vietnam War is immoral is not because it isn't protecting us, but because it's murdering innocent people, it's being fought with stolen money or whatever. There are also lots of people who think, or at least there were a few years ago, there are still some people who think the Vietnam War is practically necessary. They think it is an effective way of preventing the communists from eventually conquering us. For some curious reason, I have not yet met a single person who holds both of those views. I haven't met a single person who both believes that the Vietnam War is in a very strong practical sense necessary, that enormously important things will be lost if we don't fight and win it, and also believes that it is by its nature immoral. Now, some people, of course, have a way out of this. The objectivists would claim that they have derived morality from practicality, and therefore that problem in principle can't arise. All right, my answer to that would be the objectivists have in fact derived a particular set of moral statements. Essentially the same thing that I would call the libertarian ethic, thou shalt not coerce. They say that those statements are equivalent to practicality, but that's an assertion. That's something they think they've derived. I think they haven't. If I can demonstrate a single situation in which their ends would be served by coercing, then from my standpoint, that's a conflict between morals and practical. From their standpoint, that means there was something wrong with their derivation of morals and they should have derived a different moral. So I'm just saying that so that all you objectivists won't feel left out and won't feel that my remarks have nothing to do with you. They just come out as a different problem for you than they come out for me. All right, let me give you one very hypothetical case where you could have this conflict between what you believe is morally the correct means and the ends you want to achieve. Right? This is the old problem, do the means justify the ends? And we all say they don't. But we all say they don't because none of us are ever in a position where we have to make the choice. I don't mean by that we would say that we do. They do if we were in that position. I'm only saying it would be a much, much more difficult choice. Digression number 2. I get very upset about the self-righteousness of a lot of libertarian oratory. A lot of left-wing oratory, too. I think most of that oratory depends on the following trick. You, the orator, believes that the Vietnam War is both immoral and unnecessary. You speak about the people who believe it is both moral and necessary as if they believed it was moral and unnecessary. That is, one talks about Nixon as if he shared your factual belief that the war was unnecessary, and therefore it's an incredibly monstrous criminal thing he's doing. You don't make the imaginative effort of asking, suppose I really had to make the choice. Suppose I really believe, as I suspect a good many people involved in American foreign policy do believe, that, yes, killing 50,000 innocent people is a bad thing, but suppose I really believe that if I didn't kill those people, that in 10 years or in 20 years or in 30 years, 100,000 or 500,000 or a million people would die or be enslaved. Suppose you face the kind of hard choices that people who really have to worry about sacrificing means to ends or do face. You might still come up with the conclusion that their action was immoral, but I don't think you would come up with the conclusion that they were, as I think my dear friend Dan Rosenthal put it in an argument with me, moral monsters. Because it's not a moral monster, I don't think, if you really have an enormously difficult choice and you make the wrong side. It's just wrong. It's just immoral. So that I would say that if somebody really believes, for instance, that you'll have horrible inflation unchecked going to the skies without price and wage control, and he imposes price and wage controls on you, it is appropriate, if necessary, for me to shoot him to prevent him from doing so. He is morally in the wrong. He's violating my rights. But it is not appropriate in that situation for me to feel he is a horrible, hateful, immoral, monstrous man. Because if I believed the same things he believed, although I might not come to the same conclusion, I would at least feel strongly tempted to. I would be under severe pressure, and I think it's this kind of pretending that the problems don't exist that creates a lot of the furor of the sort that I don't like. It offends me. Maybe it doesn't offend you. Some people think... There was an article in Libertarian Connection a long time ago which got me very annoyed, and its basic thesis was there's really only one fundamental necessity to be a libertarian. That's got to be good at hating. I don't remember who wrote it, incidentally. All right. So now I want to go into discussing this question of ethics, and I want to start out with what I think is the premise that all of us think we hold, and that I think I hold, but I'm less certain than you are, which is that the ends don't justify the means. All right? The thesis is that whether the results are good or not, you shouldn't coerce people, ever. All right? Now, let's observe some of the problems that might be involved. First, you have the problem where the moral solution is unworkable. Let me take take a couple of examples. The first example is the question of the airwaves. I think everybody here probably agrees the airwaves ought to be private property. It is, however, my opinion, I may be wrong about this, but it's my guess, that there is no way of finding out who has a legitimate moral claim to them. Maybe if you searched back through the records far enough, you could. But since at the time that the law of this was developing, it got diverted. It didn't develop into some kind of a private property by homesteading, the way most of us think it should have. It did get taken over by the government. All right. Now, we all say, fine, the government should auction off the airwaves. Government auctions off the airwaves. You buy the right to broadcast on a particular frequency, and I start a radio broadcasting on that frequency in the anarchist society, which results after we've sold off the rest to the government, too. All right, you come to me and say, I own that frequency. You can't broadcast. And I say, by what right do you own it? All right, you see the problem? There's no problem practically. Practically, we would all be better off if the airwaves were property. But if we have no way of finding that somebody who really has a moral claim to own them, then anybody who enforces that property right is an aggressor, is a coercer. He's enforcing an illegitimate property right. All right? So that strikes me as a very serious problem. Does that mean that, see, the practical solution is easy. If you follow the objectivist line except for the conclusion, you say, we do what serves our life is served by our setting up institutions which recognize property rights in airwaves, therefore we should arrest people who then trespass on these property rights. But if you believe in the conclusions the objectivists reach, that is, say, the libertarian ethic, you believe you can't coerce people, then I cannot see where you're going to find the moral justification to come to me and make me stop broadcasting on those frequencies. All right? Another similar problem occurs with patents. Dr. Rothbard has given what strikes me as the morally and economically correct way of handling patents, but which I believe is unworkable. He's not the only person who's got it. Sky Dorius made the same argument later, but Rothbard has priority. Other people may have, I don't know. What he says is, you have no, I make a thing, you see it, you copy it. I don't own your mind, I've got no right to prevent you from doing that. Right? Therefore, he says, the morally correct way of getting the effect of patents is when I make an invention, I put a little note on it, which says, or which everybody understands to mean, nobody may buy this machine unless he agrees only to let people look at it who agree not to use the idea in it without my permission. All right? Now, morally, that's a beautiful solution to the problem. Because, see, that takes care of the parallel invention problem. If the obvious moral objection to patents is that I am forbidding you from inventing the thing yourself because I invented it. Well, how can I do that? Well, in this case, if you invent it yourself, you're all right. You're in the clear. You never signed any agreement not to use the idea. You never looked at my machine, so forth. That's a beautiful solution, except that as far as I cannot see any practical way of enforcing that arrangement because of the following problem. I invent a machine, I put it on the market. Now you come out on the market with an identical machine. I go to you and say, look, you must have violated a contract somewhere, you can have the machine. And you say, well, what contract did I violate? And I say, well, you must have looked at one of my machines. You say, yeah, sure, I looked at one of your machines. I never agreed not to look at one of your machines. Oh, maybe the guy who showed it to me violated a contract. If you can find him, you can sue him. Fine, fine. But why should I help you find him? I've got no obligation to do that. I didn't know that he had a contractual agreement with you. Once I've looked at it, now it's inside my head. All right? For me, it's like, suppose you sell me a stolen axe and I cut down a tree with it. All right, you can repossess the owner can repossess the axe, but I didn't know it was stolen. I had no responsibility to check that it was stolen. You can't claim that I got to put the tree back. All right, well, similarly, I looked at the machine because somebody violated his contract at some point, or was careless, or somehow let me see the machine. I'd signed no contract. I'm not bound. The idea is now in my head and it's my property and I can do what I damn well please with it. So that as far as I can see, now maybe there's a solution to this. If Sky were here, he might find one. He's one of the most ingenious people in the movement. Maybe he's one of the most ingenious people in the world. I don't know. Very clever fellow. I wish you were here, incidentally. Free ad. Sky Dorius. He's crazy, but he's brilliant. West Coast Libertarian and very, very interesting fellow. I have pre-prepared the introduction I use if I ever introduce him at any Libertarian conference, and if I ever do, you'll hear it. Anyway, so it seems to me that you have a situation where the correct solution is not workable, where from a practical standpoint, you could say my suspicion is that the kind of arrangement we have now, very roughly, with maybe some improvements, might be the best solution, where you say we will sort of assume as a rough approximation that anybody who comes up with the same machine in the next 15 years probably stole it from you. Beyond that period, they probably invented it. That's a very rough approximation, but it gives us better than not having anything. That's how we now how to do it. But again, I don't see where one would find any moral sanction for acting on this. Now let me go back a step, and I probably don't have to talk to this audience about why morals matter. I said earlier in an earlier speech that when I'm trying to persuade people of political things, I don't talk about ethics. I don't think it's very useful. Nonetheless, we all have to live. Right? We act. Most of us are in the position of saying there are certain circumstances in which I have the moral right to kill somebody. For instance, when he is stealing some very valuable piece of my property and there's no other way I can stop him. I do not want to go around killing people on an ethical basis unless it's right. And I therefore think that if one sees problems in one's ethics, that is a very serious thing one should worry about. That's not merely a sort of a theoretical problem. One may not have to worry about it when doing economics, but one has to worry about it when living. All right. So I've given a couple of situations in which it seems to me there's a conflict between the practical and the ethical. A very important situation, which I probably ought to state briefly, is the problem of national defense. It is my opinion that because of the public good problem I discussed earlier, there might be situations in which we could not be defended without a government. Where by a government I mean an agency of legitimized coercion, people who steal from you. The difference between a government and criminals is that the government, most people think it's all right. That's why it's legitimized coercion. It's not legitimate. Sure, I'm sorry. I said a government is an agency of legitimized coercion, where legitimized means that when they steal from you, most people think it's all right. That's the difference between a government and an ordinary criminal. All right. And I'm saying it is my opinion that because of the public good problem, there could be circumstances in which the only way to be defended against conquest by some much worse government would be to have a small government of your own which stole from you. There might also be situations in which that wouldn't be the case. All right? I'm a pessimistic anarchist. You might be able to work it, you might not be able to. Suppose you're in a situation where you get down to the point where there's just this minimal government which is doing nothing but stealing a little money from you in order to defend you from other governments, and you conclude that if you get rid of it, the Russians will come over. Okay? In that situation, how do you act? Well, the conclusion that what I've always said is in that situation, you tolerate the government but do not support it. You don't refuse to pay it taxes. You don't try to persuade people to undermine it, because that would only injure you. But you don't inform on people who cheat on their income tax, because that would be aiding and theft. Well, that's fine. But all I'm saying is that's the solution as long as there's no problem. The problem arises when, suppose it were the case that the survival of that minimal government depended on my taking some action. I could be in that situation. Either I collect taxes or it goes. Well, you know, my feeling is I'd like to say, I have been saying, maybe I'll continue to say, I don't collect taxes when the Russians are away. That makes us all morally clean. Maybe not free, but morally clean. But I'm suggesting that is the kind of problem that simply facilely saying the ends don't justify the means doesn't get rid of, and that one has to think about in deciding what your ethics are. Now let me get to I should say, incidentally, that Robert Heinlein, in Moon of the Harsh Mistress, I think quite clearly and unambiguously comes down on the side of saying in that case you coerce. He is writing a book in which somebody whose views are essentially our views is faced with that moral dilemma, and his solution is that since the alternatives are either to steal a little or to have his entire society die in about 10 years, he steals. Now, I should say he also says, I won't make excuses for it. You see, one of the standard arguments against coercing for good ends is, what if everybody did it? It's a good argument, but that doesn't imply you should do it. It implies you should try to persuade other people not to do it. If you do it, don't get caught. Don't argue for it. Don't talk about it, but do it. All right? And what Prof does in Moon of the Harsh Mistress is to say, I will steal, but I won't make excuses. He recognizes that if he makes excuses, if he tries to build the exceptions into his ethical system, the temptation is going to be overwhelming time and time again to make exceptions. So that he'd rather, in a sense, be a hypocrite than hold a consistent moral position which he believes would end up corrupting him. All right? That's a digression. It's a very interesting book, though, because Heinlein is a man who sometimes deals with hard problems, and most people don't. Now, let me suggest, after I've been saying that all of us believe that the ends don't justify the means, and all of us believe that if we were faced with these problems, we would not take the immoral action, let me go on to say that all of us are hypocrites. What I mean by that is that I believe, now I may be wrong, I hope somebody can prove me wrong, I believe that we are all continually facing situations which are the moral equivalent of the very unpleasant situations I've been describing, and that in those situations we're all selling out. Let me show you the two places where that exists. The first occurs in the case of pollution. All right? I smoke a cigarette. I don't smoke cigarettes. Somebody else smokes a cigarette. Well, if the situation I was describing before was a situation where by doing a substantial amount of coercion, you could create an enormous benefit in liberty's sake. All right? And you said no. I'm talking for you. I'm putting words into your mouth. You said no. Well, that's morally equivalent. A situation where by a substantial amount of coercion you can get a huge benefit is surely morally equivalent to a situation where by a tiny amount of coercion you can get a substantial benefit. All right? Just divide the two terms of the equation by 1,000 or something. Well, you smoke. It seems to me, maybe there are problems with property rights to air. But it seems clear to me that we all engage in activities in which we violate on a very small scale the legitimate property rights of other people. You burn your leaves and the smoke drifts over and lands on my windows, making it a little bit more expensive for me to wash my windows. We in fact take those acts. So we are faced with the moral question: do we essentially paralyze ourselves? That is, do we say we will take almost no acts or no acts because taking any act will involve a very small violation of somebody's rights? Or do we act and accept that small violation of somebody's rights? And it seems to me the answer is all of us do the latter. Therefore, all of us who say what we all say are in some sense hypocrites. I should say this includes me. I mean, I decided to give the talk on this subject because these are problems that bother me. All right, problem 2. Back step one. Back one. Is the time taken? All right. Yeah, I'll give you 5 more minutes to make questions. Let me go back one step to discuss what is the moral crime we are committing in this situation. It's not quite as simple as theft, because most of us would say if the guy who's injured came to us and said, "You owe me 3 cents," we'd give it to him. It's rather the crime of a forced sale. All right? Take a traditional problem for libertarians. Your house is burning down, and the only way to get to it is cross someone else's property. Well, my general feeling is, even if there's a no trespassing sign, I cross the property on the assumption that if he knew the situation, he would be willing to let me over. If I'm wrong, I pay him judgment. But suppose he's sitting in the house, and he says, "Nope, no trespassing, I will not let you cross." Well, then, it seems to me that most of us would say, I don't have the right to cross. Even if I'm willing to cross and then pay him what I think he should have been willing to accept. Right? That's a forced sale. That's saying to him, I'll decide what the right to cross your lawn is worth, and I'll pay it to you, and I'll do it. And that's immoral, even though you're willing to bear what you think the cost is, because it's not the cost he's willing to accept. Same thing as eminent domain. All right? Eminent domain by a relatively honest government would consist of going to somebody and saying, we will make you sell at what we think is a fair price. You don't have the moral right to do that. All right? Now let me take the last and most disturbing case. It seems to me the libertarian ethic asserts, I do not have the right to impose a cost on you which involves violating your rights to benefit myself. That's a no-no. All right? Now, I get in a car and drive. Let's suppose I do it on a private road. No problems with that. I know when I drive that there is a certain probability of that car skidding off the road and killing somebody, smashing into somebody's house, doing something of that sort. Furthermore, the probability of that is something under my control. I could choose to drive very rarely and very slowly. I could choose to spend a lot of money on keeping my car in good condition. I've got all sorts of different options of what I could choose to do. When I choose to do anything other than taking the minimal risk, I am imposing a cost on you, the hypothetical person who I might hit. I am imposing you to a certain risk which you have not voluntarily agreed to be opposed to accept. Now, people will say, but I'm willing to, the difference between me and a thief is that I'm willing to pay up if I hit you. That's just that may be the difference between me and a thief, but it's not the difference between me and the urban renewal man with his eminent domain. Because the assumption is that I haven't gotten... See, the moral solution would be that I would have to go to everybody who lived along the road and say to each one, if I give you 15 cents, will you agree that you don't mind my risking your life by driving along the road? As long as I haven't done that, I'm in the position of imposing a cost on people for a price that I've decided on, not that they've decided on, not a price they're willing to accept. Right? So, there is the problem. It is a very serious problem. It appears to me that one can carry this argument very far in the direction of saying the only moral thing to do is to freeze, or jump in the lake, or something like that. I don't know quite whether there are any good alternatives. But it seems to me that what I've produced is what the mathematicians call a reductio ad absurdum. Right? A reductio ad absurdum is the following argument. You take a certain set of premises and you reach an impossible conclusion. One of the premises must be wrong. All right? Now, I am not saying that what I believe because of this argument is I mayn't drive a car. What I believe because of this argument is that libertarian ethics, as I understand them and as I think you understand them, must be an approximate statement of some more complicated state of ethics. And I do not know what that more complicated set of ethics is, and I would like to know. Thank you.
I have two questions. First of all, I could possibly justify a means other than an end? And second, with regard to your last case, aren't you sort of taking the situation of putting the burden of proof on the wrong person? The burden of proof should be on the person who says that you are risking violation of this other person's rights by driving your car. Until that person is proven you are risking his rights, then you are free to exercise your rights.
Well, let me answer the question in order. I should say I'm interested to know that Rothbard said those things because my father said exactly the same thing to me many years ago in I think identical words.
It's in the footnotes in Power and Law.
Very likely. That may be an example of the famous saying, great minds run in the same ruts. I don't think... all I can say is clearly the only thing that justifies the means is the ends. That does not necessarily mean that good ends justify any means, which is what the argument is about. And the question, and you've got the whole question of what ethics is and where it comes from, all of which I've avoided because obviously that would be a much longer talk than this one was. But all I can say is I'm not an objectivist, and I don't believe that you can derive ethics merely from saying that set of behavior which serves my life or which is best for me. And I'm not sure I know where else you can define it. But fine. Your first question is really simply asserting you do not believe in what I've described as libertarian ethics. Fine. In that case, the problems I've described are not problems for you. They're problems for those of us who do. Now, your second question was burden of proof. I'm not talking at the moment about what courts should or shouldn't enjoin people from doing. Maybe if the situation came up as a court case, I might agree that the court shouldn't do anything until the guy who lives by the highway comes up. I'm asking what I should do. Well, I believe that I have an absolute moral obligation not to violate other people's rights, whether they've gotten around to proving to me that I'm violating them or not. And so therefore my feeling is that if I conclude that an action I am doing is morally equivalent to theft, I don't do it. And that's where the problem comes from. Yeah?
Yeah, on the patent problem, presumably the person who signs this first contract to use the machine will want to make sure that people who come and see it will not help him violate the contract, so instead of the cost. So presumably he'll have them sign the contract also. Not to give away the ideas, and that will go on and on and on.
I don't know if you understood. I should have given the problem at greater length. In most cases, you're going to want to lease the machine to many people. You want many copies of it. In some cases, the number is enormously large. For instance, if the invention is the actual thing you're selling, like a tape recorder. All right. Now, I am one person who owns a tape recorder. Let's take a really hard case, which has got a new invention in it. I have signed a contract agreeing not to show anybody how this tape recorder unless they agree not to reveal it. I happen to be a thief. I'm an immoral man. All right. I say to myself, I can go to somebody who is also immoral, and I can say to him, look, you know and I know I've signed this contract, but there ain't no way in the world that they can prove you know it. There isn't any moral way that they can compel you to tell them who you saw it from. Right? They don't have, so therefore you are going to copy it from me, pay me a large sum of money, and then lie about it. So that I'm not saying that people can morally violate it. I'm only saying that I don't see any practical way of keeping people from immorally violating it. It's not very useful to have solutions that you can't enforce.
David, in your example of the forced sale, I think that you're ignoring completely the possibility of arbitration. For instance, there was I forgot where I read this case where there was a family out on a lake, and there's an island in the middle of the lake. The storm came over the island. The family burned it on the island. The guy came out and said, get off. And they said, no, there's a storm going, he cut the boat loose, the boat was destroyed. Now the court, and I'm not sure if this is coming to common law or not, found in favor of the family. In spite of the fact that we're violating this guy's property rights. So that in a forced sale, like if your house is burning and the guy refuses your passage, I think that the question here is not whether or not you're doing anything wrong, it's the question whether or not I think the arbitrator will consider you doing anything wrong in keeping quote unquote objective law.
I guess I have to say that you may be describing how the institutions would work, but it seems to me as far as the ethical question is concerned, that if I don't have the right to use your property for my ends without your permission, then I don't have the right to use your property for my ends without your permission, whether my house is burning down or not. And that seems to follow me. Now, it may very well be that if you're asking what law will actually arise, I would argue, this is an entirely different argument, but I have, I think, argued elsewhere. If I haven't, I will sometime, that a free market system of courts would produce a law, a system of law, which would be precisely the objectivist utilitarian system of law. What I mean by that is that the objectivists supposedly have derived their ethics from what's in the interest of man. All right. Well, that's not very far from the utilitarian saying total welfare. And I would predict that on the market, a market law, a market system of courts would produce that law for reasons I can go into. Therefore, from my standpoint, it would produce a law which was immoral in this respect.
Well, also, there's the point of whether or not the person trying to know property rights.
How?
He's causing you a disservice.
In that case, I'm violating your property rights when I refuse to spend the next 3 hours explaining my argument to you. That's causing you a disservice. You'd be better off if you had me as a slave. I think you'd be better off. I mean, you may not think so.
I've got several questions and comments, but I'd like to first start off by congratulating you on very provoking.
Walter, could you just take one question so we can have some of the others? There's not that much
I'll
time.
make them real quick. The first one, I just want to offer an answer to the punishment dilemma that Murray and Pat Iverson worked out. And this is we call two teeth for a tooth. I think this settles both the practical question and sort of the formal question. In other words, if I steal a pencil from you, ordinarily, all I have to do is give back a pencil. And if you got it right away without any cost, I'd have no disincentive. But this is not really punishment at all, because I didn't give you anything in mind. I think that the punishment should consist of having done to me exactly what I did to you. In other words, first thing we do is we take your pencil out of my pocket and give it to you. But that's not punishment, because you're not hurting me any, compared to the honest situation. The second stage is we do to me what I try to do to you, namely we give you a pencil. So in that way, it's really two teeth for a tooth, and I think that'll go some way towards solving the practical question while keeping some sort of formal thing. And you shouldn't say, well, why not 1.9 teeth or 2.1 teeth? It's 2.0000 teeth, because, you know, when you add them up, I've given you two pencils or two teeth or what have you. Do you want me to read the others? Or
Why don't I answer one at a
Walter, I
time?
prefer to give the others an
the
opportunity.
others are so much better.
But my answer to that question is, first, I can make up answers too. And although that is, you know, it's a neat rule for doing it, I don't see a particular basis for it. Second, that rule fails to work if less than 50% of fees are cost. Then you got to go for 3.0.
Now, the problem with Walter also is it doesn't answer the question, why punish at all? Why not just, it should be. But I think you sort of botched the whole moral practical thing in your discussion. And the point is, what you're saying, you talked about the war. Some people think it's necessary by what standard? And some people say, well, you know, you say it's a tenable position, it's immoral and necessary. But I think the basic question is that everybody has to answer is, for any point like this, is should the war be fought? And the question, should the war be fought, is itself an ethical question. For whatever reasons you say it should or should not be fought, it's an ethical question. What you're describing is a person who holds at the same time two contradictory ethical standards. That, you know, not killing and stopping communism at all costs. And the resolution of, well, obviously that has to be resolved in some way, but that's not a moral practical question, that's a question between two contradictory ethical standards.
Yeah, no, there's certainly a sense in which what you're saying is true, but in that sense, we hold contradictory standards. What I mean by somebody believing that the war, that it's necessary to fight the war, I'll put it in very simple terms. Somebody who believes that if we withdraw from Vietnam, in 30 years we will be living in the equivalent of Stalinist Russia. Right? I'm saying it appears to me that if any of us believed that, we would find it much more difficult to take the position of saying that the war is clearly immoral. Clearly, in a sense, when you talk about conflicts between means and ends, you're talking about a conflict between two ethics. You're talking about a conflict between an ethical system which says there are certain things you may not do. That's an ethics of rights. And you're talking about an ethical system which says there are certain things that are more or less valuable. That's an ethics of ends. And what I'm saying is that normally the libertarian ethic, as I have understood it, preached it, and tried to live by it, says that you can follow the ethics of ends only conditional to the ethics of means. But the ethics of ends only tells you what you can do within the things you have a right to do. And that when you face a conflict where there is some thing which is very, very high, very, very valuable on the ethic of ends, but which can only be achieved by violating the ethics of means, you have the kind of conflict I'm describing. Yeah.
Yeah, Dave, you talked about cavalier treatment of important topics, which I think is exactly the sort of thing your father engaged in yesterday with regard to praxeology, the theory of Nietzsche. Now, praxeology, of course, evolved the subjective value theory of the marketplace, and at least it appears to me that you oscillated several times in both of your talks between objective value theory and subjective value theory. When you talked about the guy with the broken arm, you said establishing a price for his discomfort would be difficult because interpersonal utility comparisons are very hard to make. That's subjective value theory. On the other hand, you talked about the standardization, which is implicit in your Rolls-Royceification of all our car preferences, and also in the case of the commons with the sheep, for instance, if the men valued commonality in and of itself, they would be willing to sacrifice some fatness of the sheep or something like that. Now, all I'd like to do is comment on the subjective and objective market theory.
Yeah, sure. As far as I can tell, in terms of doing economics, the only procedure for handling values that I feel comfortable with, that I think I sort of understand and know what it's doing in a clear, straightforward fashion, is subjective value defined by what people are willing to pay for something. And in that sense, of course, if people are willing to have what appears at first to be an economically inefficient system with the commons because they like holding commons, then that's a profit-maximizing behavior with lots of non-monetary profit. However, I am not willing to assert that